Before we begin, a quick content warning. Paranormal Pajama Party is a podcast about scary stories and legends, but there's nothing scarier than the patriarchy. When discussing tales in which women are often the villains, we'll have to unpack some stories in which women are the victims. This episode contains the usual amount of cursing, as well as mentions of forced captivity, pregnancy, and incest. Please be advised. Tonight's episode is about a woman who is prematurely entombed, and even though her good-for-nothing brother totally knows it, he does nothing to help her for an entire week. If you ever find yourself prematurely entombed, please send me an email at paranormalpajama@gmail.com. I promise to come get you much more quickly than that. You can also email me about other stuff, too. I'd love to hear from you. Annabel Lee by Edgar Allan Poe, originally published in 1849. It was many and many a year ago, in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child, and she was a child, in this kingdom by the sea, but we loved with a love that was more than a love, I and my Annabel Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And this was the reason that long ago in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me, to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. The angels, not half so happy in heaven, went envying her and me. Yes, that was the reason, as all men know in this kingdom by the sea, that the wind came out of the cloud by night, chilling and killing my Annabel Lee. But our love, it was stronger by far than the love of those who were older than we, of many far wiser than we, and neither the angels in heaven above nor the demons down under the sea can ever dissever my soul from the soul of the beautiful Annabel Lee. For the moon never beams without bringing me dreams of the beautiful Annabel Lee, and the stars never rise but I feel the bright eyes of the beautiful Annabel Lee. And so all the night tide I lie down by the side of my darling, my life and my bride, in the sepulchre there by the sea, in her tomb by the sounding sea. Hi, I'm Steph, and this is Paranormal Pajama Party, the podcast that brings you classic ghost stories and legends featuring female phantoms and femme fatales. Together, we'll brush the cobwebs off these terrifying tales to shed some light on their origins and learn what they can tell us about the deep-rooted fears society projects onto women. If you're listening in real time, thanks for your patience with this gap between episodes. I'm in the middle of a massive work project, and literally the moment that we stopped production, I got sick. It was like I spent a week being the kitten in the hang in there poster, and then my body was very abruptly like, okay, we're letting go now. Good luck. Bye. So I'm sorry for both the big gap and the nasally voice, but I'm back in the saddle. Last time, we barely escaped being smushed by the fall of the House of Usher. You can go back and listen to my abridged version of the story. I cut out some poetry, mostly. But just to quickly recap, this short story by Edgar Allan Poe, released in 1839, is told from the perspective of an unnamed narrator who visits his childhood friend, Roderick Usher, at his family's decaying mansion in an extremely bleak area. Roderick and his twin sister, Madeline, are the last of the family line, and neither is doing so hot. Roderick is suffering from mental illness and is convinced that the house and its surroundings are playing a role in it. Madeline is deathly ill with some disease that has her doctors stumped, and Roderick is worried that once she dies, they might want to steal her body for science reasons. Madeline kicks the bucket, and Roderick and the narrator entomb her in the family crypt below the house to foil any would-be grave robbers. But over the next week, Roderick goes even further off the rails, listening for sounds that aren't there, staring into space, and acting super nervous. His behavior starts to make the narrator feel pretty crazy too. On the night of a massive storm that has them both on edge, the narrator tries to read Roderick a book to calm him down, but keeps being interrupted by spooky noises elsewhere in the mansion. It turns out that those noises are being made by Madeline, who they entombed alive. Worse, Roderick kind of knew it the whole time but didn't do anything. She bursts into the room and collapses on her brother, killing him instantly. The narrator flees the house as it splits apart and sinks into the pond at its base, symbolizing the end of the Usher family line. Madeline is the story's only female character, and she's a good example of Poe's favorite trope, the beautiful dead woman. In the last episode, we talked about how his tragic personal circumstances, especially the deaths of important women in his life, including his mother, foster mother, and young wife Virginia, shaped Poe's fascination with the aesthetics of death and the idealization of young and beautiful women starting to rot. Messed up, Edgar. Anyway, we're lucky to have Madeline Usher here with us again tonight. Hey, Maddie. Yeah, she still hasn't said anything. It's getting really awkward. In her defense, she might not be able to say anything, because she's just a reflection. The fall of the House of Usher is full of them. There are obvious reflections. The house splits into two halves when it eventually collapses, but before that, it's reflected in the pond at its base. When the narrator first shows up, he tries to see if the fungus-covered manor looks any better if he looks at it upside down in the water. No dice, it's still upsetting as hell. The most obvious reflection, of course, is the twins, Madeline and Roderick. Although they're male and female, they apparently have very similar features because the narrator realizes they're twins when he sees Madeline up close for the first time while they're entombing her. Poe's intention in writing this story was to answer the question of what would happen to the mind if the body were to die. And if you've listened to any other episode of this podcast, you will not be surprised to learn that in the fall of the House of Usher, Roderick, the male twin, represents the mind, and Madeline, the female twin, represents the body. It's another case of men being associated with reason and higher order thoughts, and women being associated with physicality and earthiness because of the whole baby-making thing. Lame. The characters' names are a clue about this symbolism. According to no less an authority than thebump.com, Madeline means tower, and Roderick means both ruler and glory. The mind rules the body and is, I suppose, glorious in its own gooey, gray matter way. But as the story shows, the glorious mind starts to go a little, what is the phrase I want? Cuckoo banana pants when it's trapped inside a body that has begun to physically decline. Neither can live without the other. Madeline, the body, and Roderick, the brain, came into this world together, and they have to leave it together too. One of the ways I abridged the story last week was by cutting a poem that offers another clue about Roderick's and Madeline's mind-body connection. I'll link it in the show notes so you can read it. It's called The Haunted Palace, and it's a song Roderick sings to the narrator while they're trying to distract themselves from Madeline's slow demise. On the surface, it's about a happy prince in a palace full of dancing courtiers. Then some outside enemy comes and the king's family is destroyed, becoming phantoms haunting the castle's halls. Poe actually wrote and published The Haunted Palace separately before eventually including it in this story, and said about it, "I mean to imply a mind haunted by phantoms, a disordered brain." The palace in the poem is a human head, and the phantoms are the insane mind. And there you have another reflection, right? The phantoms swirling around the haunted palace are a reflection of Roderick's unhappy time pacing the halls of the House of Usher. The narrator even compares the house's windows to empty human eyes when he arrives at the mansion at the beginning of the story. Interestingly, in Mike Flanagan's 2023 miniseries, The House of Usher, which uses this story as kind of a bookend for the rest of the Poe-inspired stories within it, they've reversed the body and brain role. Madeline is a scheming super genius, and Roderick is basically her flunky. she has to literally use his body to make her plans work early in the storyline because as a woman in the 70s or whatever, she can't get a non-secretarial job at the corporation that they're trying to take over. In the show, Roderick's physicality is also underscored because almost all the other characters are his children, legitimate or otherwise. Speaking of children, was Madeline Usher pregnant in the story? Some scholars think she might have been, and that part of the horror and fascination her doctors had with her in the story, and the reason Roderick might have wanted to keep them away from her body, is that there was only one person around who could have been the baby daddy. When the narrator realizes mid-corpse drop-off that Madeline is Roderick's twin, Roderick is kinda cagey about it. He murmurs something and tells the narrator, sympathies of a scarcely intelligible nature had always existed between them. If that has your eyebrows raised, you are not alone. A lot of people read an implication of incest into that line, especially after the narrator explains that the reason Madeline and Roderick are the last of their line is because the branches of their family tree kept dying, so it's actually more of a family pole. But the last of the Ushers are both weak. Their baby was never going to make it, and that might explain some of Roderick's existential horror that he represents the last of the House of Usher. It would also be another indicator that Madeline represents the body. She's the one who would have carried the child, which we've already established is one of those unrefined things that women are always doing. A cultivated male mind would never. Using a hint of incest to make a horror story more horrific is pretty rich, by the way, coming from an author who married his 13-year-old cousin. But more than brains, bodies, and babies, what I really want to talk about is Madeline, a woman, as a reflection of her brother Roderick, a man. A reflection is intangible. It's not real. It's just light bouncing off the real thing. And unfortunately, in both storytelling and in life, we see women objectified as decor all the time. In stories told by men, we are often cast as figurative mirrors in particular. We're just objects meant to echo or amplify the image of the much more important and much more real men around us. Poe published The Fall of the House of Usher in 1839 at the height of popularity of something that historian Barbara Welter called the cult of true womanhood, or the culture of domesticity. And Poe and his compatriots, especially in his area of the US, the Northeast and East Coast, were all about true womanhood. In the popular imagination, society existed in different spheres, public and private, work and home. The job of a true woman, as opposed to all of us fake women, I guess, was to be, quote, the light of the home. The true woman knew her place in the domestic sphere and stayed home, where she kept the house, cooked the food, directed servants, and raised the children for her husband while he was out caring for and protecting the family with his big manly job. Don't get me wrong, just because she was running everything at home doesn't mean she was in charge of the domestic sphere. Obviously, men were in charge. God made them that way, you see. Yeah, this is a very Christian idea, and the people who subscribed to it were very white, Christian, and middle or upper class. Women of color or working class women were 100% not included in the cult of true womanhood, which I guess means they weren't true women. And we're just getting started with the problematic shit. True women were defined by their personification of 4 cardinal qualities: piety, purity, submission, and domesticity. Men were encouraged to find pious wives who followed the many, many rules laid out in the highly patriarchal Christian Bible because the other qualities were sure to follow. Purity won't surprise you. Women were taught that their greatest asset was an intact hymen. Nothing was more valuable than their virginity, a gift they guarded carefully, thanks to their piety, and bequeathed to their husbands only on their wedding night, at which point he became their protector, guide, and superior in every way. That's where submission comes in. Even if they disagreed with their husbands intellectually, which was unlikely because they were discouraged from reading anything other than religious biographies and ladies' journals, just in case they started to have ideas about things outside their home sphere, true women obeyed their husbands, their divinely ordained headships, and catered to their every need. The job of the true woman was to lose her virginity in a good American marriage to a good American man, take care of his good American house, and ensure that she created a sanctuary away from the chaos of the outside world for that man and his good American sons, the ones who would grow up to run the country someday. Their whole purpose was to create a peaceful oasis for their husbands, tell them how worthwhile and important they were, and create more future brides and grooms who would do the same thing. If you're like, holy Harrison Butker, this sounds like tradwives, you are 1000% correct. This is exactly the same stuff that TikTok and YouTube tradwife influencers believe. Let me be clear. In my view, feminism means supporting women to be able to make whatever choices they want for their lives. That's the whole point. I want you to have a choice. You don't have to be a CEO or on the front lines of the military or be the president. You can absolutely be a stay-at-home mom, homeschool your children, start an off-grid homestead, worship any god you want. You are free to make that choice. That's the fucking point. But I will say this to modern tradwives who believe it shouldn't be a choice and that all of us should be popping out babies and pies with equal frequency. There's a lesson to be learned from the cult of true womanhood, and you're not going to like it. But first, back to Poe. In the context of the time, where women were meant to reflect their husband's greatness and not presume any of their own, it makes sense that he would fall in love with his beautiful groomed cousin Virginia, who idolized him. And it makes sense that the women in his stories would be two-dimensional set pieces whose existence really only serves to further the male lead's storylines. In Madeline Usher's case, we never learn anything about her life, and we barely learn about her death. We don't know what she went through for the 7+ days that she was trapped. She woke up from a cataleptic episode, entombed prematurely in a tight coffin, and she stayed there until she gathered the strength, finally, to rip off the lid and escape from the horrible, dark tomb where she had been trapped, alone, without food, water, company, or care. We know that somehow, through spooky twin communication or his sensitive hearing, Broderick knew they had jumped the gun. He knew that she was in there alive and still didn't bother to mention it because of his own neuroses. And if she was also aware that the siblings' inevitable deaths meant the end of a long line and had lost a baby fathered by her own twin brother, and also suspected that perhaps the house itself, an archaic mother whose empty crumbling halls reflect her own empty crumbling body, was to blame for her physical decline and the mental decline of the only person she loved, perversely but still truly, doesn't that add another layer of horror to everything? The fall of the House of Usher is an incredible story, of course, and I'm not arguing that point. All I'm saying is that Madeline's side of the story is worth telling in its own right. She doesn't have to be an amplifier for Broderick, who is incidentally coded feminine and therefore even wackier because he's apparently unable to get it together and leave the female domestic sphere of his home. But the story Poe chose to tell is the male one, and perhaps that's because Madeline, as a woman created by a male brain in this particular era, doesn't matter. She's only there to serve as a supporting character to the men's real lives, just as the women bound by the ideals of true womanhood were only there to make men's lives easier and richer, like fancy appliances. I would say that sweet little Virginia Poe seems to have conducted herself as a so-called true woman ought. That is, she was definitely pure and submissive, although I would guess, based on the way I feel this week, that her debilitating and fatal illness may have gotten in the way of her domestic abilities. But the other women in Edgar Allan Poe's life were decidedly not ideal true women. The thing about true womanhood was that it fucked women over if their husbands left them or died young. The true woman wouldn't take a working job. In fact, she often couldn't. One side effect of the popularity of this idea and women losing power in the public sphere was that women were legally prohibited from working or had their working hours severely limited, which also limited the professions they could have. Women without husbands were screwed. They literally couldn't earn a living. But remember, single mom Eliza Poe continued to act for as long as she could to take care of her family, and his Aunt Maria, Virginia's mother, took in sewing work and boarders when her husband died early. Poe was surrounded by and idealized women who were not sterling examples of true womanhood. In fact, he actively pursued them. I mentioned this briefly in the last episode, but even while married, Poe was regularly falling in love with other women. He seems to have especially been a sucker for a fellow poet. He was always writing poems for these women, or claiming to, anyway. It actually seems like he would recycle old poems and tell each new woman, "I wrote this for you, baby." But none of these women, from the prominent poet Frances Sargent Osgood to the successful editor Sarah J. Hale, who, incidentally, wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb and invented Thanksgiving, were submissive domestic types. They were publishing under their own names and working outside the home. Madeline Usher may be one of many Poe women whose own story goes untold, but in real life, Edgar was attracted to strong women who made a mark on society. It's baffling to think that he had all of these amazing three-dimensional examples that he could have modeled his female characters on, and he just opted not to. There are no well-rounded Poe women. The fucking bird gets more lines than most of his female characters. It's infuriating. Sometimes writers or artists impose weird, arbitrary limits on themselves. By forcing themselves to work within these strict boundaries, they can come up with some incredibly creative solutions. In a way, True Womanhood was the same. It tried to set strict boundaries on women's minds, freedom, and power. And wouldn't you know it, they found a way to work within the boundaries and still get away with exactly what the patriarchy was worried about. True women lost power in the public sphere, but at home they gained a powerful symbolic power, the moral authority of their families. Men were sent out into the working world, guided by the wisdom and morals modeled to them by their wives, and young people grew up following the standards set by their mothers, their primary teachers and caretakers. It's basically Inception. Women may not have been actively working, but by golly, they were often pulling the strings behind the scenes. And the next generation of women, well, you know what happens to kids raised in strict households once they get a little bit of freedom, right? The next generation of gals cut their hair short. They rode bicycles even if it meant their uteruses might fall out. They demanded further education. And they demanded the vote. True women birthed new women, and new women became first-wave feminists, the suffragettes. The patriarchy didn't let go of true womanhood, though. It tried to make it work again in the US after World War II, when women were forced to leave the jobs they'd taken while men were fighting overseas and return to the home. They were meant to be pious, pure, submissive, and domestic. They were meant to grow the nuclear family. And they did. For a while. And then Betty Friedan showed up and wrote The Feminine Mystique and kicked the whole thing off again. Blam! Here comes feminism's second wave. Following the ideals of true womanhood is the best way to create and raise a generation of rebels. The pattern repeats, and so it goes. In A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf wrote, "Women have served all these centuries as looking glasses, possessing the magic and delicious power of reflecting the figure of man at twice its natural size. Whatever may be their use in civilized societies, mirrors are essential to all violent and heroic action. That is why Napoleon and Mussolini both insist so emphatically upon the inferiority of women, for if they were not inferior, they would cease to enlarge." That serves to explain in part the necessity that women so often are to men, and it serves to explain how restless they are under her criticism, how impossible it is for her to say to them, "This book is bad, this picture is feeble," or whatever it may be, without giving far more pain and rousing far more anger than a man would do who gave the same criticism. For if she begins to tell the truth, the figure in the looking glass shrinks, his fitness for life is diminished. How is he to go on giving judgment, civilizing natives, making laws, writing books, dressing up, and speechifying at banquets, unless he can see himself at breakfast and dinner at least twice the size he really is? Woolf wrote that in 1929, and the new woman, exemplified by the flappers of the Roaring Twenties, had well and truly shown up by then. But clearly, women were still being used to reflect men, and I'm not sure that much has changed 100 years later. In film, TV, and literature, especially in the horror genre, it's not hard to find contemporary examples of women used the same way Madeline Usher was used, to further the storylines of male protagonists. Take, for example, Supernatural, the TV show about two hunky, ghost-bustin' brothers. Their mother? Murdered by a demon, causing her husband to go on a demon-hunting rampage and raise his sons to become demon hunters themselves. I stopped watching around season 3, I think, but the internet tells me they continued to meet babes, and those babes continued to either be evil and die eventually, or be good and die immediately. Remember season 1 of True Detective? That was a good one. Woody Harrelson and Matthew McConaughey are detectives and partners investigating a bunch of occult murders in Louisiana. The women in the show, including Woody's character's wife, are either love interests, victims, or sources of personal conflict for the male leads. Time really is a flat circle, baby. Let's hop over into literature, shall we? I read The Fisherman a month or so ago. I was so excited to read it because the horror lit subreddit recommends it all the time, and I love me some cosmic eldritch horror, but god damn it. Without spoiling anything, it's a story about a man whose beautiful wife dies young, who befriends a man whose beautiful wife dies young, and there's a story within a story about heroic men that also features a few beautiful wives who go on to, you guessed it, end up dead. I'm trying to remember, and I'm not positive that it even passed the Bechdel test, where two named female characters talk to each other about something other than a man, but if it did, it was maybe only if you count wordless possessed groaning at someone as conversation. Then there are movies. David Fincher's Seven, which came out in 1995, stars Kevin Spacey, Brad Pitt, Morgan Freeman, and Gwyneth Paltrow, and despite being jam-packed with some of the most problematic people in Hollywood, it's a pretty good serial killer movie. Unless, of course, you're looking at it from a female representation perspective. The entire point of Gwyneth Paltrow's character is to be a peacekeeping, motherly figure, and then her character loses much more than half a day of skiing. Also, alleged real-life abuser Brad Pitt could prove that he had the acting chops to be more than just a pretty face. I made a couple of Tim Burton references in my last episode, and I suspect those parallels are not accidental. Edgar Allan Poe's aesthetic and influence are still prominent in goth and horror media. Of course, I'm not saying that his treatment of female characters is responsible for the underrepresentation of women in horror, or for the trend towards giving us gruesome and often eroticized deaths that only serve to inspire male characters when we do show up. But I don't think it helped either. Women are generally underrepresented across media, although anecdotally it does seem like things are becoming more diverse, which is fab. So this isn't a horror issue alone. I also don't want it to seem like I'm shitting on these TV shows, books, or movies. Most of them are great. I just think it's important to consider how women are represented, both in storytelling and in the real world. Are we given fleshed out, three-dimensional roles, or are we only there to advance male characters' development or story arcs? Are we included as individuals with inner worlds and motivations? Or, as Virginia Woolf said, are we just mirrors? It's time for lights out at the Paranormal Pajama Party. Thank you so much, Madeline, for... Madeline? Madeline? She's just lying there looking really pale and still. Could she... Oh shit. Madeline? Oh my god. You faker, you got me. Yikes. To learn more about True Womanhood and to read The Haunted Palace, check out my sources in the show notes. Follow Paranormal PJ Party on Instagram to see visuals from today's episode. I'll be back next week with more spine-tingling tales and critical discussion. In the meantime, don't forget, ghosts have stories, women have voices. Dare to listen.